The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldoria Palace as Captain Marcus Blackwood strode through the corridors with unprecedented authority. His polished boots echoed against the ancient stones, each step carrying the weight of a decision that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Behind him, a dozen elite guards followed in perfect formation, their faces masks of professional duty, hiding the shock they all felt. For 23 years, Marcus had served the crown with unwavering loyalty. He had protected 3 generations of royals, survived 2 assassination attempts, and earned more medals than any guard in the palace's 800-year history. But today was different. Today, he carried a scroll sealed with the ancient crest of the Royal Council, and the knowledge of what lay within that parchment made his stomach churn. Queen Isabel sat in her private chambers, completely unaware that her world was about to crumble. She delicately sipped her morning tea while reviewing the day's schedule with her personal secretary. At 62, she remained elegant and sharp, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture as regal as the day she had married into the Eldorian royal family 35 years ago. She had weathered political storms, economic crises, and personal tragedies with grace. Nothing, she believed, could surprise her anymore. The heavy oak doors to her chamber burst open without ceremony. Marcus entered, his usually warm demeanor replaced by cold professionalism. The Queen's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, her eyes widening at the unprecedented breach of protocol. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice maintaining its composure. "Despite the obvious irregularity, surely you know better than to enter without permission." Marcus removed his ceremonial hat and placed it under his arm. His weathered face, scarred from years of service, showed no emotion as he spoke. "Your Majesty, I come bearing an official decree from the Royal Council and the High Court of Eldoria." The Queen's secretary quietly excused herself, sensing the gravity of the moment. Isabel remained seated, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the arms of her chair. In all her years as Queen Consort, she had never seen Marcus look so formal, so distant. By order of the Royal Council, convened in emergency session at dawn, and with the unanimous support of the High Court, Parliament, and the Church of Eldoria, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Your title as Queen Consort of Eldoria is hereby revoked, effective immediately." The words hit Isabel like physical blows. Her composed facade cracked for just a moment before years of royal training took over. She stood slowly, her back straight, her chin raised defiantly. "On what grounds?" she demanded, though her voice betrayed the slightest tremor. Marcus unrolled the scroll, his eyes scanning the formal language before meeting her gaze. "Financial misconduct, abuse of royal privilege, and actions detrimental to the crown's reputation. The evidence has been under investigation for 6 months." The Queen's mind raced. 6 months. How had she not known? How had her network of allies, her carefully cultivated relationships, failed to warn her? She thought of the offshore accounts, the questionable charitable donations, the favors traded for personal gain. All things she had convinced herself were within her rights as queen. "Prince Alexander," Marcus continued, referring to the Crown Prince, "has been informed and supports this decision. He will assume the throne at noon today in an emergency coronation." This was the deepest cut. Alexander, her stepson, whom she had raised from the age of 12 after his mother's death. The young man she had guided through his tumultuous teenage years, supported through his military service, and advised on matters of the heart. He had known and had chosen not to warn her. "I demand to speak with him," Isabel said, her royal authority still evident despite her crumbling position. "That will not be possible," Marcus replied. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings. A car will escort you to Rosewood Manor, where you will remain during the investigation. All royal privileges, including your security detail, communication access, and financial accounts, are suspended." The full weight of her situation began to sink in. Rosewood Manor was the royal family's equivalent of exile, a comfortable but isolated estate 50 miles from the capital, where disgraced royals had been sent for generations. No visitors without permission, no communication with the outside world, no influence over the kingdom she had helped shape for decades. "My charitable work," she began, grasping for something, anything that might delay this nightmare. "The children's hospitals, the education programs, they need my guidance." "All your official duties have been reassigned," Marcus said, not unkindly, but with finality. The kingdom will continue without you. As the guards began their methodical removal of royal seals and official documents from her room, Isabel felt the life she had built slipping away like sand through her fingers. The woman who had once commanded the respect of world leaders, who had been photographed with presidents and prime ministers, who had her every word analyzed by the press, was now just another fallen royal. Outside her windows, she could see the palace staff already removing her portrait from the main hall. History, she realized, was being rewritten in real time, and she was being erased from it with ruthless efficiency. The clock on her mantel chimed the half-hour. 30 minutes left of a life that had taken decades to build. Prince Alexander stood before the ancient mirror in the royal preparation chamber, his reflection showing a man transformed by the weight of unexpected responsibility. At 34, he had always known this day would come, but not like this. Not with the bitter taste of betrayal still fresh in his mouth. Not with the knowledge that his stepmother's downfall was partially his doing. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the ceremonial collar of state around his neck. The gold felt heavier than it should, each link a reminder of the throne he was about to inherit under such controversial circumstances. Behind him, his longtime valet Thomas worked silently, understanding that this was not a moment for conversation. The investigation that had brought down Queen Isabel had begun innocently enough. Alexander had been reviewing the kingdom's charitable expenditures as part of his preparation for eventual kingship when he noticed discrepancies in the Queen's foundation accounts. What started as concern for fiscal responsibility had spiraled into something much darker. Millions of pounds meant for orphanages and hospitals had been diverted to shell companies. Lucrative contracts had been awarded to businesses owned by Isabel's relatives. Foreign dignitaries had paid substantial donations for audiences with the royal family. Money that disappeared into personal accounts rather than the royal treasury. The evidence had been overwhelming, but Alexander had hoped to handle it privately, within the family. That hope died when the Royal Council's investigators uncovered even more damaging information. Isabel hadn't just been stealing money. She had been selling state secrets to foreign governments, trading diplomatic intelligence for personal financial gain. "Your Highness," Thomas said softly. "It's time." Alexander nodded, taking one last look at himself in the mirror. The man staring back was no longer a prince learning the ropes of leadership. He was about to become King Alexander III of Eldoria, ascending to the throne amid the greatest royal scandal in centuries. The throne room had been hastily prepared for the emergency coronation. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies of previous generations, this would be a stark, formal affair attended only by essential government officials, military leaders, and religious authorities. The press had been kept at a distance, though Alexander knew that wouldn't stop the storm of speculation already brewing beyond the palace walls. As he walked down the crimson carpet toward the throne, Alexander caught sight of Marcus Blackwood standing at attention with the palace guard. The captain's face remained impassive, but Alexander could see the conflict in his eyes. Marcus had served the royal family faithfully for decades, and carrying out Isabel's removal couldn't have been easy. Archbishop Morrison, his ceremonial robes hastily arranged, stood waiting beside the throne with the crown of Eldoria resting on a velvet cushion. The archbishop's usual warm demeanor was replaced by solemn duty. Even the most sacred traditions of the kingdom had been compressed into this urgent ceremony. "Citizens of Eldoria," the archbishop began, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet chamber, "we gather today under extraordinary circumstances to witness the ascension of Prince Alexander to the throne of our ancient kingdom." Alexander knelt before the throne as tradition demanded, but his mind wasn't on ceremony. He thought of Isabel, probably packing her belongings at this very moment, preparing for exile. Despite her crimes, she had been the closest thing to a mother he had known since age 12. She had taught him about duty, about the weight of royal responsibility, about the sacrifices required for the crown. The irony wasn't lost on him that her lessons about sacrifice had ultimately led to her own downfall. "Do you solemnly promise to govern the people of Eldoria according to their respective laws and customs?" the archbishop intoned. "I solemnly promise to do so," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. The ancient words continued, each vow binding him more completely to a role he had trained for all his life. but never expected to assume under such circumstances. As the archbishop lifted the crown, Alexander caught a glimpse of movement in the gallery above. Security personnel were discreetly positioning themselves, a reminder that even this sacred moment was shadowed by the scandal that had brought it about. The crown settled onto his head with surprising heaviness. Not just the physical weight of gold and jewels, but the metaphorical weight of a kingdom's trust, a trust that had been badly shaken by the woman who had helped raise him. "I present to you King Alexander III, your undoubted king," the archbishop declared. The small assembly rose as one, their voices joining in the traditional response. "God save the king." But even as the ancient words filled the throne room, Alexander knew that saving the kingdom would require more than divine intervention. It would require rebuilding trust, restoring dignity to the crown, and proving that the sins of one royal did not corrupt the entire institution. Through the tall windows of the throne room, he could see protesters already gathering in the palace square. Some carried signs demanding the abolition of the monarchy. Others called for justice for the money stolen from charitable causes. The kingdom he now ruled was already fracturing along lines of loyalty and outrage. His first test as king would begin the moment he left this room. Every decision, every word, every gesture would be scrutinized by a public that had lost faith in royal integrity. The crown that now rested on his head felt less like a symbol of power and more like a target. As the ceremony concluded and the assembly began to disperse, Alexander remained on the throne for a moment longer than protocol required. In the sudden quiet of the chamber, he could hear the distant sound of crowds gathering outside, their voices rising in protest and support in equal measure. The kingdom of Eldoria had a new king, but whether it would remain a kingdom much longer was a question only time would answer. The black sedan carrying former Queen Isabel through the countryside moved like a funeral procession, its tinted windows hiding the face of a woman whose world had collapsed in the span of a single morning. Beside her sat Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, the lead investigator whose meticulous work had unraveled years of carefully hidden corruption. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken accusations and bitter truths. Rosewood Manor appeared through the morning mist like something from a Gothic novel. Once a symbol of royal luxury reserved for honored guests and peaceful retreats, it now served as an elegant prison for disgraced royalty. The tall iron gates closed behind them with a finality that made Isabel's stomach clench. "How long?" she asked, speaking for the first time since leaving the palace. Detective Chen consulted her tablet. "The investigation could take 6 to 8 months depending on your cooperation and what else we uncover." Isabel almost laughed at the word cooperation. What choice did she have? Every account had been frozen. Every ally had abandoned her, and every bridge she had built over 3 decades had been systematically burned. The woman who once wielded influence across continents now couldn't even make a phone call without permission. Meanwhile, back at the palace, King Alexander faced his first crisis as sovereign. The royal press secretary, Emma Hartwell, stood before him with a stack of newspapers and tablets displaying headlines that made his blood run cold. "Corruption Queen exiled," screamed the Daily Herald. "Royal scandal rocks kingdom," declared the Times of Eldoria. International media had picked up the story, with BBC World News leading with Eldorian monarchy in crisis. "The public response is mixed," Emma reported, her usually confident demeanor showing cracks of stress. "About 40% support your decision to remove the Queen. 30% are calling for complete abolition of the monarchy. The remaining 30% want to wait for more information." Alexander studied the photographs accompanying the articles. Images of Isabel at charity galas, cutting ribbons at hospital openings, meeting with foreign dignitaries. All now recontextualized as evidence of her deception. The same smile that had once been described as gracious and warm was now being called calculating and false. "We need to get ahead of this narrative," Alexander said, loosening his tie. The formal coronation clothes felt like a costume now, ill-suited for the political warfare he was about to wage. "Schedule a press conference for this afternoon." His private secretary, James Morrison, looked up from his phone with concern. "Your Majesty, might I suggest waiting? Let the initial shock settle before—" "No," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Every hour we stay silent is another hour for conspiracy theories to spread. The kingdom needs to hear from their king. Outside the palace walls, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Protesters had been gathering since dawn, their numbers swelling as word spread through social media. Margaret Thornton, a retired teacher whose pension fund had been invested in one of Isabel's fraudulent charities, held a sign reading, "Our money, your palaces." Beside her, university student David Park live-streamed to his followers, explaining why the monarchy itself was the problem, not just one corrupt queen. But not all the voices in the crowd were hostile. Lord Geoffrey Ashford, a longtime family friend and parliament member, worked the crowd trying to build support for the new king. Alexander had the courage to expose this corruption, he told anyone who would listen. That shows integrity, not weakness. The divisions weren't just external. Inside the palace, centuries-old alliances were fracturing. Senior staff who had served under 3 monarchs found themselves choosing sides. Head butler William Pemberton, who had worked closely with Isabel for 15 years, submitted his resignation rather than continue serving the institution that had destroyed her. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Helen Crawford, who had discovered some of the initial financial irregularities, threw her full support behind the new king. At Rosewood Manor, Isabel stood at the window of what had once been her favorite guest room, watching her former security detail patrol the grounds. They were no longer protecting her, they were guarding her. The distinction felt like a knife twist with every uniformed figure that passed beneath her window. Her thoughts turned to Alexander and the impossible position she had put him in. She remembered his 12th birthday, just months after his mother's death, when she had promised him that family meant loyalty above all else. Now he had chosen the kingdom's loyalty over hers, and she couldn't decide whether to feel proud of his integrity or devastated by his betrayal. Detective Chen had made it clear that cooperation could lead to reduced charges, possibly even avoiding prison time. But cooperation meant naming accomplices, revealing the full extent of her network, destroying the lives of dozens of people who had trusted her. The web of corruption she had built over the years involved cabinet ministers, foreign diplomats, business leaders, and even other members of the royal family's extended circle. Her phone, one of the few privileges she retained under strict monitoring, buzzed with a message from her lawyer. "Need to discuss plea options. Evidence is overwhelming. Cooperation strongly recommended." Back at the palace, as Alexander prepared for his press conference, he received an encrypted message that made his blood freeze. Intelligence services had uncovered evidence that Isabel's financial crimes might have compromised national security. Foreign governments had apparently paid her for access to classified briefings, military strategy discussions, and diplomatic negotiations. The woman he had called mother for over 20 years hadn't just stolen money from charities. She had potentially endangered the entire kingdom. The press conference was scheduled for 4 o'clock. By 3:30, every major news outlet in the world had camera crews positioned outside the palace gates. Alexander's personal crisis was about to become a very public test of his fitness to rule. Standing in the private study that had belonged to his father, surrounded by portraits of kings who had ruled for centuries, Alexander realized that the next few hours would determine not just his reign, but possibly the future of the monarchy itself. The kingdom of Eldoria had survived wars, economic collapse, and social upheaval. Now it faced its greatest challenge: surviving the truth about the woman who had been its queen. The palace press room had never felt smaller to Alexander as he walked toward the podium at precisely 4 o'clock. Every seat was filled with journalists whose skeptical faces reflected a nation's shattered trust. Camera flashes exploded like artillery fire as he adjusted the microphone, knowing that his next words would either begin the restoration of the monarchy or accelerate its destruction. "Citizens of Eldoria," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I stand before you today not as a prince who inherited power, but as a man who chose duty over family, truth over comfort." The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, loudspeakers carried his words to the thousands gathered in the palace square, their reactions ranging from hopeful attention to angry skepticism. The evidence against former Queen Isabel is overwhelming and undeniable. Over the course of 15 years, she systematically embezzled funds meant for charitable causes, accepted bribes for royal access, and sold state secrets to foreign governments. Each word felt like a betrayal, but Alexander pressed on. The total amount stolen exceeds £50 million. Gasps echoed through the press room. Even veteran journalists who had covered political scandals for decades seemed stunned by the scope of the corruption. BBC's chief correspondent, Patricia Wells, raised her hand. "Your Majesty, how long have you known about these activities?" Alexander had practiced this answer, but it still felt like swallowing glass. "I became aware of financial irregularities 6 months ago during routine reviews of royal expenditures. When the evidence pointed to criminal activity, I had a choice: protect the person who raised me or protect the kingdom. I chose Eldoria." His words carried across the country through live television coverage. In a working-class pub in Manchester, factory worker Tom Harrison paused his lunch to listen. In an upscale London restaurant, banker Christine Adler stopped her business meeting. In the small village of Thornfield, where one of Isabel's fraudulent charities had promised a new children's hospital that never materialized, elderly librarian Ruth Blackwell gripped her walking stick tighter. "What about the monarchy itself?" shouted reporter James Crawford from The Guardian. "How can the institution survive when corruption reached its highest levels?" This was the question Alexander had dreaded most. "The monarchy is not one person," he replied. "It is an institution built on service, tradition, and accountability to the people. When any member, including a queen, violates that trust, they must face consequences regardless of their position." At Rosewood Manor, Isabel watched the press conference on a small television in her room, each word from Alexander cutting deeper than physical wounds. Detective Chen sat beside her, studying her reactions for any sign of guilt or remorse. "He's a stronger man than I gave him credit for," Isabel murmured, surprising herself with the pride mixed into her devastation. "Strong enough to testify against you in court," Chen replied matter-of-factly. "The prosecution will likely call him as their star witness." The press conference continued with increasingly aggressive questions. Sky News correspondent Michael Torres asked about Alexander's personal finances, demanding transparency about his own accounts and investments. Financial Times reporter Sarah Kim questioned whether the entire royal family had benefited from Isabel's crimes. "I have instructed the royal treasurer to conduct a complete audit of all royal finances going back 20 years, Alexander announced. "Every account, every investment, every expenditure will be made public. If corruption exists anywhere else in the royal household, it will be exposed and prosecuted." The bold promise sent shockwaves through the assembled journalists. No monarch in Eldorian history had ever voluntarily submitted to such complete financial transparency. In the Parliament building across London, Prime Minister Robert Sterling watched the press conference with his senior staff. The political implications were staggering. If Alexander succeeded in restoring public trust, the government's relationship with the monarchy would need complete restructuring. If he failed, Sterling might be managing the first elected president in Eldorian history within years. "What's your read?" Sterling asked his chief advisor, Catherine Mills. "He's either a political genius or committing institutional suicide," Mills replied. "There's no middle ground." Back in the press room, the questions grew more personal. Daily Mail correspondent Jennifer Walsh asked about Alexander's relationship with Isabel, whether he had ever confronted her about her behavior, whether he felt responsible for not stopping her sooner. "Isabel was the closest thing to a mother I had after my own mother died," Alexander said, his composure cracking slightly for the first time. Discovering her crimes was devastating personally, but being king means placing the welfare of 14 million citizens above your personal relationships. The raw honesty in his voice seemed to shift the room's energy. Some journalists lowered their tablets, their expressions softening from adversarial to almost sympathetic. Telegraph senior correspondent David Hughes asked the final question: "What happens next for the monarchy, Your Majesty?" Alexander paused, looking directly into the cameras that would carry his words around the world. "The monarchy will earn back your trust through actions, not words. Every royal expenditure will be transparent. Every decision will be accountable to Parliament and the people. We will be servants of Eldoria, not its masters." As he left the podium, the press room erupted in shouted follow-up questions, but Alexander had said what he came to say. The rest would be determined by how the kingdom responded. In living rooms across the nation, families debated what they had just witnessed. Some saw a young king with courage and integrity. Others saw damage control from a corrupt institution. But everyone agreed on one thing: the monarchy would never be the same. Outside the palace gates, the crowd's mood had shifted from angry protest to uncertain anticipation. Margaret Thornton, still holding her sign about stolen pension money, found herself standing next to Royalist supporter Geoffrey Ashford. "What did you think?" she asked him. Ashford considered carefully before answering. "I think we just watched either the beginning of a new kind of monarchy or the end of the old one." In her exile at Rosewood Manor, Isabel turned off the television and stared out at the darkening sky. The boy she had raised had just become a king, and in doing so, had chosen the crown over the woman who had helped prepare him for it. For the first time since her arrest, she wondered if she might actually be proud of him. 3 weeks after Alexander's press conference, the investigation had transformed from a royal scandal into a national obsession. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen had assembled the largest financial crimes task force in Eldorian history, with 47 investigators working around the clock to untangle 15 years of sophisticated corruption. The evidence room at Scotland Yard resembled a war room, with walls covered in photographs, bank statements, and connection charts showing the web of accomplices Isabel had cultivated. Swiss bank accounts, shell companies in the Cayman Islands, fake invoices from phantom construction projects. The scope of her operation had shocked even seasoned fraud investigators. She was brilliant, Chen admitted to her partner, Detective Marcus Riley, as they reviewed the latest findings. "If she hadn't gotten greedy with the foreign intelligence sales, we might never have caught her." The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Foreign Secretary Amanda Parker, reviewing classified briefings for an upcoming NATO summit, had noticed that several sensitive military discussions Isabel had attended were later referenced in intelligence reports from hostile nations. Cross-referencing dates with Isabel's private meeting schedule revealed a pattern of information sales that made her not just a thief, but potentially a traitor. At Rosewood Manor, Isabel's isolation was becoming unbearable. Her lawyer, Catherine Whitmore, visited daily with updates that grew progressively worse. Former allies were cooperating with investigators, revealing additional crimes in exchange for reduced charges. Cabinet Minister Douglas Fletcher had admitted to accepting bribes for construction contracts. Ambassador Patricia Vaughan had confessed to selling visa approvals to wealthy foreigners. "They're offering you a deal," Whitmore explained during her morning visit. "Full cooperation, complete disclosure of all activities and accomplices, in exchange for house arrest instead of prison." Isabel stared out her window at the gardens she had once found beautiful but now felt like prison walls. "And if I don't cooperate?" 25 to 30 years in maximum security prison. At your age, it would essentially be a life sentence. The weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. Every decision that had seemed justified at the time. Taking money from charities that had excess funds, accepting payments for royal access that didn't hurt anyone, sharing diplomatic insights with trusted friends who happened to represent foreign governments, had built into a mountain of evidence that could destroy her completely. Back at the palace, King Alexander was discovering that transparency came with unexpected consequences. The financial audit he had promised was revealing embarrassing but not criminal expenditures. £100,000 renovations to rarely used guest rooms, private jets for personal vacations disguised as diplomatic trips, staff numbers that seemed excessive even for a royal household. Public opinion was slowly shifting, but not uniformly. Polling showed that 62% of citizens now supported keeping the monarchy, up from 48% immediately after Isabel's removal. However, support was heavily divided by age and region. Younger voters remained skeptical, while older citizens appreciated Alexander's decisive action. The real test came when Parliament convened for an emergency session to address the royal crisis. Prime Minister Sterling faced pressure from his own party members, who saw the scandal as an opportunity to reduce royal power significantly. "The monarchy has shown it cannot be trusted with financial independence," declared Labour MP Susan Crawford during heated debates. "We propose that all royal expenditures above £10,000 require parliamentary approval." Conservative MP Jonathan Hartley countered, "King Alexander has shown more accountability in 3 weeks than most politicians show in their entire careers. We should support reform, not punishment." Alexander himself made an unprecedented decision to address Parliament directly, becoming the first monarch in over 2 centuries to speak before both houses during a crisis of confidence. "Honorable members," he began, standing at the same podium where prime ministers had announced wars and peace treaties, "I come before you not claiming divine right or inherited privilege, but seeking to earn your trust through accountability." His proposal was radical. The monarchy would voluntarily surrender control over its private wealth, submitting all expenditures to a parliamentary oversight committee. Royal properties would be managed by a public trust. Even personal expenses of royal family members would be subject to annual review. "If the price of serving as your king is giving up financial privacy, I pay it gladly," Alexander declared. The chamber, usually raucous with political debate, fell silent. Even opposition members seemed stunned by the scope of his voluntary concessions. Meanwhile, international reactions were mixed but intense. The European Union expressed concern about political stability in a key ally. The United States State Department issued a carefully worded statement supporting democratic accountability and rule of law. Russia and China, both targets of Isabel's intelligence sales, publicly called for her extradition to face espionage charges. The most unexpected development came from an encrypted message sent to Detective Chen's secure government account. A whistleblower claiming to be a former associate of Isabel's offered information about additional crimes involving nuclear facility security briefings sold to Iranian contacts. If verified, the charges against Isabel would expand from financial fraud and corruption to treason and threats to national security. The death penalty had been abolished in Eldoria decades earlier, but treason still carried a potential life sentence without parole. At Rosewood Manor, Isabel received the news about the expanded investigation from her lawyer with surprising calm. "How much worse can it get?" she asked, but her voice carried the hollow tone of someone who already knew the answer. "The prosecutor is suggesting that cooperation now might be your only chance to avoid spending the rest of your life in prison," Whitmore replied. "They want names, dates, amounts, methods, everything." Isabel walked to her window, looking out at the security patrol that marked the boundaries of her world. In the distance, she could see photographers with long telephoto lenses, still hoping to catch a glimpse of the fallen queen for tomorrow's newspapers. "Set up a meeting," she said finally. "I'll tell them everything." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. But the alternative, dying in prison as a forgotten symbol of royal corruption, felt infinitely worse. Back in London, King Alexander received word of Isabel's decision to cooperate through official channels. He should have felt relief that the investigation would finally have the information needed to reach its conclusion. Instead, he felt only sadness for the woman who had once taught him that royal duty meant protecting those who served the crown. Now, she would spend her final years revealing how thoroughly she had betrayed that very principle. The secure conference room at Scotland Yard felt like a confessional as Isabel sat across from Detective Inspector Chen, Prosecutor Malcolm Stevens, and 2 intelligence officers whose names she wasn't given. A stack of legal documents 3 inches thick lay between them, representing the deal that would spare her from dying in prison in exchange for destroying the lives of dozens of accomplices. "Let's start with the foreign intelligence sales," Stevens began, his voice professionally neutral despite the gravity of the accusations. "We have evidence of payments from representatives of 6 different countries. We need details about what information was provided and through what channels." Isabel closed her eyes, remembering the first time she had crossed that line. It had seemed so innocent, sharing her impressions of a visiting Russian diplomat with a contact who claimed to be writing a book about international relations. The contact had paid her £50,000 for what she told herself were harmless observations. "It began 8 years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ambassador Viktor Petrov introduced me to a man named Chen Wei, supposedly a journalist from Singapore. He was interested in my perspectives on British foreign policy." Detective Chen leaned forward. "Not related to me, I assume?" "No relation," Isabel confirmed. "Wei was actually a Chinese intelligence operative, though I didn't know that initially. He was sophisticated, charming, and he made the information sharing seem like academic discussion rather than espionage." Over the next 6 hours, Isabel detailed a network of foreign contacts who had systematically extracted classified information from her access to cabinet meetings, military briefings, and diplomatic strategy sessions. The scope was staggering. Nuclear facility locations, NATO defense plans, trade negotiation strategies, intelligence assessments of foreign leaders. The nuclear information, Stevens pressed, his composure finally showing cracks. You provided facility locations and security protocols to Iranian contacts? Isabel nodded, tears streaming down her face. They told me it was for academic research on international nuclear policy. I needed the money for the charity accounts, the real charities. I convinced myself I was helping fund good causes. The intelligence officers exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about national security implications. Facilities would need to be relocated, security protocols completely overhauled, international partnerships reassessed. Meanwhile, across London, King Alexander was holding an emergency cabinet meeting to address the expanding crisis. Foreign Secretary Amanda Parker looked exhausted as she briefed the room on international reactions to Isabel's confessions. The Americans are furious about the NATO intelligence breaches, she reported. They're questioning whether we can be trusted with classified information. The French are demanding a complete review of all shared intelligence from the past 8 years. Our credibility as an ally has been severely compromised. Defense Secretary Michael Thompson added grimmer news. 3 joint military operations had to be aborted because we have to assume their details were compromised. The cost in terms of strategic positioning will be felt for years. Alexander listened to each report with growing despair. What had begun as a domestic scandal about charity fraud had evolved into an international crisis that threatened Eldoria's position on the world stage. What's our diplomatic exposure? He asked. Significant, Parker replied. We're looking at potential sanctions from allies who feel betrayed. Trade relationships are being reconsidered. Some countries are questioning whether to honor existing treaties. The irony was bitter. In trying to save the monarchy through transparency and accountability, Alexander had revealed damage that might make the kingdom itself a pariah among nations. Back at Scotland Yard, Isabel's confession continued with the domestic corruption network. Treasury Secretary Helen Crawford had been correct to be suspicious of the charity account irregularities, but she hadn't discovered the full extent of the scheme. Cabinet Minister Douglas Fletcher wasn't just accepting bribes, Isabel revealed. He was actively soliciting them. Construction companies had to pay a percentage of contract values directly to accounts I controlled. Anyone who refused found their bids rejected regardless of merit. Stevens documented each revelation methodically. How many government officials were involved? 17 that I can name with certainty. Probably a dozen more who may not have known they were participating in criminal activity. Isabel paused, realizing she was condemning people who had trusted her. Most thought they were just doing favors for the Queen. The list read like a directory of British establishment figures: junior ministers, senior civil servants, military officers, diplomatic staff, even judges who had provided advance warnings about investigations into Isabel's business associates. As the day wore on, the full scope of systemic corruption became clear. Isabel hadn't just been stealing money. She had been selling the integrity of British governance itself. At Rosewood Manor that evening, Isabel sat alone in her room, emotionally drained from 8 hours of confession. Her cooperation had earned her house arrest rather than prison, but the cost felt higher than freedom itself. She had spent the day systematically destroying everyone who had ever trusted her. Her phone rang, one of the few privileges she retained under strict monitoring. The caller ID showed Alexander's private number. "Hello," she answered, uncertain whether she wanted to have this conversation. "I watched the news coverage of your cooperation," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "I wanted you to know that I understand how difficult today must have been. Do you?" Isabel asked, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "Do you understand that I just spent 8 hours destroying the lives of people who thought they were helping their queen?" "I understand that you made choices over many years that led to this moment," Alexander replied. "And I understand that facing the consequences took courage." The conversation hung between them, heavy with years of shared history now poisoned by betrayal and exposure. "I'm proud of the king you've become," Isabel said finally, "even if I hate the cost of your integrity." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "The kingdom will survive this. The question is whether we will." After ending the call, Isabel stared out her window at the lights of distant London. The city where she had once held power was now the site of her complete downfall. Tomorrow would bring more questioning, more confessions, more destruction of lives that had intersected with her corruption. The woman who had once been queen of a kingdom was now the key witness in its greatest political scandal. History would remember her not for the hospitals she had opened or the causes she had championed, but for the trust she had betrayed and the institutions she had corrupted. Outside, the security patrol continued its rounds, ensuring that justice would be served completely, regardless of the cost to everyone involved. 1 year later, the Old Bailey courtroom was packed beyond capacity as former Queen Isabel stood to hear her final sentencing. The woman who had once commanded the respect of world leaders now wore a simple black dress, her hands folded quietly as Judge Patricia Morrison prepared to deliver a verdict that would define the remainder of her life. King Alexander sat in the public gallery, his presence causing a stir among the assembled journalists and legal observers. Protocol had not required his attendance, but he had insisted on witnessing the conclusion of the scandal that had transformed his reign and his kingdom. Isabel Charlotte Whitmore, Judge Morrison began, using Isabel's maiden name rather than her royal title. You have been found guilty on 47 counts including fraud, money laundering, bribery, and violations of the Official Secrets Act. The scope and duration of your crimes represent the most serious breach of public trust in modern British history. Detective Inspector Chen watched from the prosecution section, her investigation having uncovered crimes totaling over £120 million and compromising national security relationships that would take decades to rebuild. 17 government officials had been arrested based on Isabel's cooperation, with trials scheduled to continue for the next 2 years. However, the judge continued, your complete cooperation with authorities and the invaluable intelligence you provided about ongoing security threats have been taken into consideration. The courtroom held its collective breath. I sentence you to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole in 8 years, provided you continue to cooperate with ongoing investigations and security assessments. Isabel closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with relief. She had expected 20 years or more. The cooperation agreement that had destroyed so many relationships had ultimately saved her from dying behind bars. As she was led away in handcuffs, her eyes met Alexander's for a brief moment. He nodded almost imperceptibly, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement of the courage her cooperation had required. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was immediate and intense. Royal correspondent Emma Hartwell reported live for the BBC. Former Queen Isabel will serve at least 8 years for crimes that shook the monarchy to its foundations. But the bigger question remains whether King Alexander has successfully reformed the institution or whether this scandal has irreparably damaged the crown's credibility. The numbers suggested a complex answer. Public approval of the monarchy had stabilized at 56%, higher than immediately after the scandal, but lower than traditional levels. More importantly, the reforms Alexander had implemented were working. Every royal expenditure above £1,000 was now publicly documented. Parliamentary oversight of royal finances had revealed and eliminated numerous wasteful practices. The monarch's role in government had been significantly reduced, with ceremonial duties emphasized over political influence. Prime Minister Sterling, who had initially worried that the scandal might force him to manage the transition to a republic, now found himself defending the reformed monarchy. King Alexander has shown that accountability and tradition can coexist, he told Parliament during a debate on constitutional reform. The crown is stronger for having faced this crisis honestly. International relationships were slowly healing. The United States had resumed full intelligence sharing after extensive security protocol reviews. NATO had reinstated Eldoria as a trusted partner, following complete transparency about compromised operations. Some damage would be permanent, but the kingdom's allies had been impressed by the thoroughness of its response to the crisis. At Rosewood Manor, now converted back to its original purpose as a royal retreat, Alexander often walked the grounds where Isabel had spent her months of house arrest. He had purchased the property from the Crown Estate, partly for its peaceful setting, but mostly because it represented the place where justice had finally caught up with corruption. The personal cost of his decisions remained heavy. His relationship with extended family members had been strained by the prosecutions of distant cousins and longtime family friends caught in Isabel's network. Several charitable organizations founded by previous monarchs had been dissolved when their connections to the scandal became clear, but there had been unexpected benefits as well. The radical transparency he had embraced had earned respect from previously skeptical citizens. Young people who had dismissed the monarchy as an outdated relic now saw it as an institution capable of reform and accountability. University student David Park, who had live-streamed protests during the initial scandal, now ran a popular social media account explaining how constitutional monarchy could function in modern democracy. Margaret Thornton, whose pension fund had been defrauded by one of Isabel's fake charities, received full restitution from recovered assets. She had been invited to a palace reception for victims of the corruption schemes, where she shook hands with the king who had chosen justice over family loyalty. "I couldn't have imagined this a year ago," she told reporters afterward. "A king apologizing to a retired teacher for crimes committed by his stepmother. That's not the monarchy I grew up with, but maybe it's the one we needed." Captain Marcus Blackwood had been promoted to head of palace security, his decisive action in removing Isabel earning him recognition as a guardian of constitutional principles. The moment when he had served the removal notice to a sitting queen would be studied in law schools and police academies for generations. In Holloway Prison, Isabel adapted to a life utterly removed from royal privilege. She worked in the prison library, teaching literacy classes to younger inmates and slowly finding purpose in small acts of service that bore no resemblance to her former role. Her cooperation with ongoing investigations continued, helping authorities uncover additional corruption networks she had unknowingly connected with during her years of crime. Letters from Alexander arrived monthly, formal but not unkind. He updated her on the kingdom's progress, the success of reformed institutions, and occasionally shared memories of better times. She responded with gratitude for his visits to the families of people harmed by her actions and admiration for the leader he had become. 2 years after her sentencing, Isabel received word that several international charities had been established, using assets recovered from her crimes. Hospitals in 3 countries would be built with money she had stolen and hidden in offshore accounts. Children would be educated, the sick would be healed, and the poor would be fed with resources that had once funded her luxurious lifestyle. It wasn't redemption. The damage she had caused couldn't be undone. But it was evidence that even catastrophic betrayals of trust could ultimately serve purposes larger than the individuals who caused them. King Alexander III ruled over a transformed kingdom, one where transparency had replaced secrecy, accountability had replaced privilege, and service had replaced entitlement. The crown he wore felt lighter not because its responsibilities had diminished, but because they were now shared openly with the people he served. The palace guard who had revoked a queen's title had helped crown a different kind of king, one who understood that true royal authority came not from tradition or inheritance, but from the trust of citizens who chose to grant it, and in the end that choice had made all the difference.